These artifacts, who do they belong to?
They belong to the museums where they are now, because there are laws, And if even for the artifacts which were looted in the 19th century, the war, there was laws, and the looting of war was legal. Maybe it's not moral, but it's legal. And if you want to come back on this, why don't you come back 19th century, 17th century, 16th century? You cannot stop. You don't know where to stop.
How do we get African kids to see their own artifacts?
Yes, you can do this. I think I milite for cooperation between French museums and Africa to organize exhibitions. Yes, it's okay to send them to Africa, but they must return to the French museums where they belong.
The current public position of the British Museum is that they have never formally received a letter from Nigeria asking for the bronzes back.
Because of this, position of the British Museum, that is why we now came in this meeting to formally hand over another formal request from Nigeria for the return of the Benin bronzes.
Here's a headline I just read in a German publication. The headline says, "Where do Africa's treasures belong?" Now imagine this headline differently. Imagine if it said, "Where do Germany's treasures belong?" It would be a redundant question because, of course, Germany's treasures belong in Germany. But the question would never even be asked because there would be no circumstance in which it would be.
If you have ever wandered through the grand halls of a museum in New York or London, or any of the cities often called global cultural capitals, and found yourself gazing at a collection of so-called African art, you may have seen rows of beautifully carved masks, sculptures, jewelry, ceremonial dress, weapons, musical instruments, or even humble items such as toys and cutlery. At first, the experience might feel like an exciting foray into the creativity and heritage of distant lands. The shapes, colors, and textures can astound you, and you might pause to marvel at the intricate carvings in a wooden mask from the Congo Basin, or the regal stillness of an ancient Benin figurine, or the vibrant beadwork fashioned by the Maasai, or the geometric elegance of a Fang reliquary sculpture. Yet the deeper question rarely crosses most visitors' minds. How did these items find their way here, so far from the communities that created them and infused them with life? In some exceptional infrequent cases, it is true that objects were purchased, or traded, or gifted under amicable, or at least neutral circumstances. But it is also true, often more true, that a great number of these precious artifacts were taken by force, confiscated at gunpoint, looted during colonial military raids, or removed under starkly unequal power dynamics in which local communities had little choice or understanding of the broader implications of giving them up. This imbalance of power echoes across the centuries, creating profound gaps in memory for the peoples of Africa, who find themselves in a modern world still contending with the legacy of that great dispersal of their tangible heritage. Those who were born and raised on African soil have often grown up in societies where entire chapters of their cultural and historical story feels incomplete or severed, and where the objects that once played central roles in religion, social life, political structures, and the very sense of identity are no longer in plain sight. In Africa, there is a striking gap in the shared memory of our people from the 1700s to the moment of independence in mid-1900s, a period during which colonial forces profoundly reshaped the continent. While oral traditions, songs, and dances can keep parts of the past alive, so many historically significant objects were whisked away or destroyed, thus leaving a generational void, a space where certain spiritual practices, political milestones, artisanal techniques, and everyday customs no longer have physical anchors in the form of regalia, sculptures, or other markers of collective identity. The magnitude of this dispersion cannot be overstated. According to a notable 2018 report on African cultural heritage, approximately 90% of so-called sub-Saharan Africa's material cultural legacy now resides outside the continent, particularly in North America and Western Europe. This means that entire archives of knowledge, artistry, and memory sit on distant shelves, under the watchful eyes of curators, or in the private vaults of collectors, who may not always fully grasp the spiritual and cultural significance of these items. Furthermore, artifacts establishing Africa's prime role in world civilization remain deliberately hidden to further an agenda of African inferiority. The loss caused by such a vast displacement is not just an aesthetic or emotional deprivation. It creates an enduring sense of cultural amnesia. When a society loses its sacred masks, totems, royal bronzes, religious artifacts, or historical texts, it can easily lose the stories they conveyed, the names of heroic figures, the lineages of kings and queens, the intricacies of spiritual rites, the knowledge embedded in centuries-old crafts, and the subtle influences that shape languages, music, architecture, and more. This is the phenomenon many Africans confront, a slow forgetting or distortion of traditions that once formed the bedrock of social and religious life. Where local gods and spiritual systems were once revered, they may now be dismissed as witchcraft. And where indigenous foods were once cherished, they may now be sidelined by a taste for imported cuisines, often promoted by the globalized media's portrayal of what is modern or prestigious. The result is a subconscious, sometimes explicit perception among African youth and even adults that their own heritages are somehow inferior, and that richer, more refined, or more valid ways of living belong to others, especially Europeans. To tell stories of who we are or where we have come from, artists and historians, priests and teachers, parents and grandparents need the tools of both imagination and memory. But imagination, potent as it is, benefits greatly from tangible anchors that spark recollection and continuity. Without those ceremonial masks, those ancient manuscripts, those stools carved with sacred symbols, large portions of the story remain obscure. Indeed, Africans bear a sense of frustration at how many pieces of the puzzle went missing or ended up behind glass in faraway cities outside our beloved continent. While museums in New York or London, Paris or Berlin, or even lesser-known cultural hubs in North America and Europe, display these pieces as purely aesthetic wonders. For the communities that created them, they signify entire ways of life, complex belief systems, feats of engineering, genealogical lineages, and collective memories that remain important even in these times. The present state of affairs has roots in the colonial scramble for Africa, when European powers carved up the continent in a race for territory, resources, and, by extension, cultural trophies. The history of the Kingdom of Benin, located in what is now Edo State, Nigeria, offers a striking example. In 1897, British forces launched what they called a punitive expedition against Benin City, looting thousands of exquisite brass, ivory, and wooden works of art. These masterpieces, known as the Benin bronzes, though technically brass, found their way into the British Museum and numerous other institutions across Europe. For the Edo people, these were not merely decorative items. They spoke of the spiritual, social, and political cosmos of a sophisticated kingdom, a living monarchy, and a continuum of cultural identity. Similarly, in Ethiopia in 1868, British military might seize treasures from Magdala, also known as Magdala, including the crown of Emperor Tewodros II and religious manuscripts that were of deep significance to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. These too ended up in Britain, scattered among various museums and private holdings, often labeled as exotic pieces without the necessary context of how they were obtained. Across the continent of Africa, mission stations, colonial administrators, and private fortune seekers routinely participated in the confiscation or destruction of objects deemed pagan or backwards, leading to the diminishing of local spiritual practices and the unraveling of long-standing cultural traditions. The tragedy is not just that these objects were physically displaced, but that the communities left behind were denied the use and guardianship of the very things that help sustain their social, religious, and artistic coherence. Over the years, museums arose in Europe and North America, dedicating themselves to categorizing and displaying the spoils of empire as exotic or primitive art, thus shaping the Western gaze toward Africa, without always acknowledging the trauma, coercion, or violence that facilitated the arrival of these materials. Collectors and traders, of course, played their roles in exporting these items, some of them ethically, some under dubious or outright exploitative circumstances, trading precious, irreplaceable objects for small sums or worthless trinkets, exploiting economic hardships or the uneven power dynamics of the colonial era. Sometimes these deals were even framed as benevolent acts of salvage, as though to save African heritage from presumed local negligence, despite the fact that many African cultures had elaborate systems of care and preservation for items they deemed sacred or historically important. The ramifications of this forced dispersal and theft are profound. If, according to a popular proverb, until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter, then African peoples have been robbed of a portion of their own writing implements. The physical vessels that carried their oral histories, religious devotions, and genealogical records, making it all the more challenging to reclaim and retell narratives from an Afrocentric perspective. Indeed, the figure of 90% of sub-Saharan Africa's cultural legacy being outside the continent is jarring in its implications, for it suggests a continent systematically deprived of the means to articulate its histories through the artifacts that once stood as proud testaments to ingenuity, artistry, spirituality, and governance. Across Africa, from Nigeria's campaigns for the return of the Benin bronzes, to Ethiopia's pleas for the treasures of Magdala, to Zimbabwe's quest for the repatriation of the Zimbabwe birds, to the endless search for stolen Nok terracottas of Nigeria, countless communities are attempting to piece together their missing narratives. Against this backdrop, museum professionals, activists, academics, and descendants of African communities are increasingly calling on Western institutions to rectify their colonial collections and label them truthfully, acknowledging how and why these objects arrived in their possession. We are also demanding outright the return of objects that were clearly stolen or forcibly acquired, especially those that hold religious or sacred value for their communities of origin. This is not just a pragmatic question about climate control, conservation, or security measures, arguments often used to justify keeping objects in Western institutions. It is an ethical one about the right to own and interpret one's own heritage, the right to host the living presence of cultural continuity on one's own soil, and the right to pass this legacy on to future generations without undue external gatekeeping. The historical examples are many, and they help us see the immense scale of what has been lost and what could be regained. The Benin punitive expedition of 1897, perhaps the most iconic instance of colonial theft, continues to reverberate through cultural discourse, as the bronze plaques and statues from Benin, detailing centuries of the kingdom's cosmology, governance, and diplomatic relations, remain scattered across British, German, and other European museums. While restitution is a central aspect, insisting that improperly acquired objects be returned, there is also an ongoing reimagination of what African museums should be in the 21st century. No longer content with older ethnographic models that portrayed African societies as static or primitive, many African artists, curators, and cultural workers are striving to build dynamic, community-driven spaces. These new institutions would not only display heritage items, but integrate them into living cultural practices with local elders, artists, and teachers, explaining how these objects function in daily life, religion, social governance, or scientific knowledge. Digitization projects and virtual exhibitions also expand the reach of these artifacts, ensuring that people around the world can learn from African perspectives while the original items remain at home. Yet all these efforts rely on a fundamental change in how we understand the function of a museum. Rather than being a colonial trophy case or a static repository for the curiosities of others, a museum can be a communal storytelling center, a place of active dialogue where the line between past, present, and future is bridged. And for Africa, which has suffered centuries of imposed stereotypes, it is vital that this reimagination takes an African-centric path, privileging local voices, indigenous knowledge systems, and spiritual frameworks that have too often been sidelined. The momentum is building, aided by new generations of Africans who are well-versed in technology, social media, and international law, and who can mount compelling campaigns that reach global audiences. We are asking pointed questions. If Western institutions truly cherish African art, why not support the communities that made it by returning items that were violently taken? And if these artifacts really do belong to the realm of universal heritage, why aren't their countries of origin recognized as the primary custodians who can share them with the world under fair and transparent conditions?
Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.